Chapter 2. Politics and Archaeology. One of Dino's many activities was participating in the regular Bible circle that in the 1950s met at the House of Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion. The charismatic leader was not only a keen reader of the ancient Hebrew book, he also made cunning political use of it. Quite early he realized that the Holy Book could be made into a secular national text, serve as a central repository of ancient collective imagery, help forge the hundreds of thousands of new immigrants into a unified people, and tie the younger generation to the land. The biblical stories served him as a basis for everyday political rhetoric, and seemingly he genuinely identified with Moses and Joshua. Much as the leaders of the French Revolution felt they were assuming the roles of ancient Roman senators, so Ben-Gurion and other leaders of the Zionist revolution, senior military figures, and national intellectuals felt they were recapitulating the biblical conquest of Canaan, and the construction of a state along the lines of David's kingdom. Current action became significant in the context of paradigmatic events of the past. In both cases the revolutionaries dreamed of creating a completely new man, but the materials they used in his construction were taken from a mythical past. In Ben-Gurion's imagination the new Israel was the kingdom of the Third Temple, and when the Israeli armed forces captured the entire Sinai Peninsula in the 1956 war and reached Sharm el-Sheikh, he addressed the victorious troops with messianic passion. "We can once more sing the song of Moses, and the children of ancient Israel. With the mighty impetus of all the IDF divisions you have extended a hand to King Solomon, who developed Eilat as the first Israelite port 3,000 years ago. And Yotvata, called Tehran, which until 1400 years ago, was an independent Hebrew state, will become a part of the Third Kingdom of Israel." The exclusive circle that met fortnightly at Ben-Gurion's house, whose discussions were sometimes reported in the daily press, included professional historians, qualified Bible interpreters and political figures who were amateur scholars in their free time. Besides Dino, the regular participants included the professors Yeheskel Kaufman, the well-known fundamentalist Bible interpreter, and Binyamin Mazar, the leading biblical archaeologist, the then and future presidents of Israel, Yitzhak Ben-Tzavi and Shur Zalman Shazar, Rubashoff, and many other scholars and senior public figures. It was a junction of intellectual and political exchange, and it not only directed academic research but shaped public opinion, and spread its values and findings throughout the educational system. The issues discussed by the learned participants included such questions as the number of Israelites in the Exodus from Egypt, their way of life during the conquest of Canaan, the number of kings they defeated in the process, and the like. Not surprisingly, the Book of Joshua was the most popular in these lively debates, and Joshua son of Nun was the star of the show. Ben-Gurion also took part in public Bible conferences, promoted the Bible quiz, which became a national media festival, and encouraged a fever of archaeological activity, though he did not necessarily adopt its unforeseen discoveries. That a national leader should spend so much time being actively involved in historiographic issues is certainly unusual, and it may indicate the centrality of biblical mythistory in the construction of Zionist ideology. Reading Ben-Gurion's collection of articles, Biblical Reflections, one is struck by the easy swings between manipulative political pragmatism, and a special and sincere belief in the ancient truth. He keeps repeating that the Bible is the identity card of the Jewish people, as well as the proof of its claim to the land of Israel. His concept of history is clear and straightforward. When we went into exile, our nation was uprooted from the soil in which the Bible had grown, and torn from the political and spiritual reality in which it had formed. In exile, our nation was disfigured and the image of the Bible likewise deformed. Christian Bible researchers, with their Christian and anti-Semitic aims, turned the Bible into a plinth for Christianity, and even Jewish commentators, who had been removed from the environment of the Bible, its spiritual and material climate, could no longer understand the Holy Book properly. Only now, when we are again a free nation in our country, breathing once more the air which enveloped the Bible as it took shape, has the time come, I believe, in which we can perceive the nature and truth of the Bible, historical, geographical, as well as religious and cultural. His favorite Bible scholar was Yehezkel Kaufman, who believed almost all the biblical assertions and regarded the rise of Jewish monotheism as a singular and extremely ancient phenomenon. Methodologically, the Prime Minister relied mainly on D. Nuhr, the leading designer of the national historiography. After all, these two scholars breathed the same air as did the patriarch Abraham and Joshua son of Nun, as opposed to Jost or Wellhausen. Ben-Gurion, always a frustrated intellectual, also developed his own Bible theory. For example, he believed that monotheistic Hebrews had lived in Canaan for a long time before the arrival of Abraham, and it was their presence that attracted the father of the nation to their land. The national history was therefore much longer than proposed by the professional Zionist historians. Ben-Gurion even speculated that the patriotic Hebrews did not migrate en masse to Egypt but remained in the country, and that only a single family emigrated. Thus, while the exodus from Egypt was an undoubted historical fact, the people's presence in the homeland was unbroken, and it is inaccurate to assume that the nation had taken shape, heaven forbid, on alien soil. He also asked some deep questions. How did the Hebrews preserve the Hebrew language during the 430 years of exile in the land of the Pharaohs? Why, after they had been a single nation under a single leader in the time of Moses and Joshua, did they suddenly break up into separate tribes? The answers he proposed were invariably nationalistic. Indeed, his position corresponded to the official historiography and was formulated accordingly. When I find a contradiction between the Bible and external sources, archaeological or epigraphic findings, I am not obliged to accept the alien source. Could they not have mistaken or distorted the facts? From a purely scientific standpoint, I'm free to accept the testimony of the Bible, even if challenged by an external source, provided the testimony contains no inner contradictions and is not obviously flawed. Despite this scientific, secular approach, Ben-Gurion resorted when necessary to divine precepts. For example, he wrote that the great event with a decisive significance in Jewish history was the promise of the land of Canaan to the seed of Abraham and Sarah. Certainly no external source could possibly challenge the biblical author's clear and incontrovertible testimony about the divine promise. Guided by historians, the national leader with his intellectual and messianic temperament led an entire national culture. During the early years of the State of Israel, all the intellectual elites helped cultivate the sacred trinity of Bible nation Land of Israel, and the Bible became a key factor in the formation of the reborn state. Civil servants were pressured to change their names to Hebrew ones, usually chosen from the Bible, and the rest of the population, seeking to emulate the established elites, did so willingly, even enthusiastically. The old diasporic family names were eliminated, and the children were given the names of mysterious, enchanted biblical figures. The process was applied not only to people, almost every new settlement was given an ancient Hebrew name. This served a dual purpose, erasing the local Arab name and leapfrogging over the long exile, which had ended with the rise of the State of Israel. But it was not the bureaucracy of the new state that imposed the worship of the Bible on the educational institutions. Long beforehand, both the Prestate institutions and the emerging Hebrew literature had made the Bible the locus for consciousness of the past. The broad intelligentsia, including teachers, writers, essayists and poets, had anticipated high academe in the correct interpretation of Jewish history, and thus had helped shape the ideological present. With the expanding settlement movement in the early 20th century and the opening of the first Hebrew schools, the Bible became the national textbook, taught in separate lessons rather than as an integral part of the language and literature studies. This efficient system persists to the present day and is taken for granted in Israel's political culture. Immigrant teachers, and people who became teachers after arriving in Palestine, did not have to wait for the academic and establishment elites to understand the value of using the Bible as a standard text for teaching the collective past. They read Heinrich Graetz, Simon Dubnoff and Zev Yarvetz, and understood the dual function of the scriptures in shaping the national identity, the creation of a common ethnic origin for the religious communities scattered throughout the world, and self-persuasion in the claiming of proprietary rights over the country. The Hebraization that was consolidated in the educational systems developed around an ancient model of popular heroism and proud nationalism. The immense popularity of the monarchies of David and Solomon was matched only by that of the Hasmoneans, viewed as no less important. The teachers wanted their pupils to grow up to resemble not the weak parents and grandparents, but the ancient Hebrew peasants or warriors, whom the teacher's imagination depicted as following the conqueror Joshua, the warrior judges, or kings Saul and David, likewise military commanders. A sense of indigenousness was inculcated by several linked means: new history textbooks, homeland studies, arduous hikes to landscapes that made ideas concrete, all this, in addition to the separate, secular Bible lessons. After the establishment of the State of Israel, these pedagogical practices became standard in all branches of the state educational system. It is possible to obtain an idea of how ancient history was used in the ideological formation of the first native-born generation, the first Sabras, from Moshe Dayan's book Living with the Bible. Written by one of the prominent heroes of the new society, it illustrates the absorption of the invented imaginary nationalism in close conjunction with the political aims of a settler society. The book opens with the following statements. I came to know the Bible stories in my early childhood. My teacher, Meshulam Olevi, not only taught and explained the book which describes the birth of our nation, but also concretized it for us. Things that had existed 3,000 and 4,000 years ago seemed to be in us and before us. The surrounding reality helped our imagination to vault over the past and return to antiquity, to our forefathers and the heroes of our nation. The only language we knew and spoke was Hebrew, the language of the Bible. The Jezreel Valley in which we lived, the mountains and rivers around us, the Carmel and the Gilboa, the Kishon, and the Jordan, were all there in the Bible. From here the former IDF Chief of Staff and Minister of Defense proceeds to describe the journeys of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, interspersed with personal stories of his childhood and youth. The two narratives, despite their widely separated periods, seem to be intimately associated, as though they existed in a single eternity that cancelled the historical dimension. The description of the Exodus and the march through the Sinai Desert are interwoven with the modern war of 1956. The conquest of Canaan is thrillingly described and is naturally associated with the conflict in 1948, even more so with the conquest of the West Bank in 1967. The victory of little David over gigantic Goliath symbolizes all the wars of Israel against the Arabs. The Bible is the supreme justification for the presence and the colonization in modern times. Every battle echoes an ancient act. The book concludes with an undisguised aspiration to see the modern state resemble the mighty kingdom of David, and a clear declaration of the desire to live in a single land of Israel that spreads from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, from the desert to Mount Hermon. The text is accompanied by beautiful photographs of the ancient Jewish land, interleaved with biblical scenes borrowed from Christian imagery. There are also photographs of ancient finds, many of them held by the proud author. Dayan did not hide his lifelong acquisitive desire for ancient artifacts. Pictures of the Jewish commander's private garden show it to be full of various antiquities. Over the years, his house became a kind of miniature land of Israel, and his possession of this precious collection, some of which he had simply stolen, testified to the domination of the promised land by this bold settler's son. Dayan was known to be an uninhibited collector. While Ben-Gurion held a Bible circle in his modest residence, Dayan turned his spacious house into a private biblical museum. The aging founder of the state gathered intellectuals around him, while his young disciple preferred to gather chiseled stones, pottery jars, and figurines. But both men wore a mantle of biblical mythology that elevated and justified their principal historical actions. Dayan was never more than an amateur archaeologist, but for another military chief of staff and Ben Gurion protege, excavating the Promised Land was a vocation and profession. Yigal Yadin had great influence over the direction of archaeology in Israel, and led the work at the most important sites such as Hazor, Megiddo, and Masada. As an archaeologist, he was the direct heir of all those Christian excavators who came to the Holy Land beginning in the late 19th century to reaffirm the Old Testament and thereby the New. From the start, their religious motivation made local archaeology an adjunct to Bible research. The greatest of these was William F. Albright, the son of an American Methodist missionary, who began to dig in the country in the 1920s and never ceased to defend the truth of the biblical story. His approach was adopted by the majority of Israeli archaeologists who came after him. Albright's best-known, summarizing work, The Archaeology of Palestine and the Bible, suggests a possible date for Abraham's migration from Mesopotamia, the 20th or 19th century BCE. Likewise, the migration of Jacob's family to Egypt is readily assigned to the 18th or 17th century BCE. Albright asserted confidently that the ancient arch and stables found at Hazor dated from the reign of Solomon, which led him to the reasonable conclusion that the age of Solomon was certainly one of the most flourishing periods of material civilization in the history of Palestine. Archaeology, after a long silence, has finally corroborated biblical tradition in no uncertain way. While preparing the second edition of this basic text on the biblical world, Albright asked Yigal Yadin to add chapters of his own, and the Israeli archaeologist willingly complied. Yadin's appendix described his discoveries at the Hazor site, which, he maintained, proved that only during Solomon's reign did Hazor rise as a great city. Its previous dormant state was due, said the diligent digger, to having been destroyed by Joshua son of Nun. Like Albright's discoveries, Yadin's excavations during the 1950s and 1960s exposed only findings that matched the biblical text. The pottery, weapons, structures, works of art and tombs were all presented as unmistakable evidence about the time of the patriarchs, the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, the boundaries of the Israelite tribal territories, and so on. Yadin's colleague, the Professor Benjamin Mazar, who later became president of the Hebrew University and recipient of the Israel Prize, and his colleague and rival Professor Yohanan Aharoni, of Tel Aviv University, filled in the rich mosaic with plentiful additional evidence. The public was given a harmonious picture of the past that accorded with the dominant historiographic discourse. The material science of the past provided definitive support for the written science, and various sites became venues of pilgrimage for the reborn nation. Occasionally there were inconsistencies, some of the discovered material rudely contradicted the sacred text. But the archaeologists would resolve such problems with cunning arguments, speaking for the mute findings and making them fit the harmonious voices arising from the Bible. Generally speaking, the last word was that of the written text, because it was the point of departure and the raison d'etre in every excavation. Needless to say, the long non-Jewish periods in the history of Canaan, Judea and Palestine hardly interested the archaeologists. In 1964 Professor Aharoni, one of Israel's leading archaeologists, published a popular work, Atlas of the Bible, which informed a whole generation about ancient geography and the movements in it of all the principal biblical figures. The wanderings of Abraham and Jacob, the exodus from Egypt, the entry of the Israelite spies into Canaan, the transporting of the ark, Saul's search for the Shiases, the movements of David's troops, and the trade routes of Solomon's kingdom, all were neatly fitted with the extra-biblical archaeological discoveries, producing an impressive visual sequence. It was the geographic, and hence a more effective, equivalent of Dino's old book, Nothing Looks More Positive and Reassuring Than a Detailed Piece of Cartography. The map's seeming reality was highly convincing, and rounded off the verbal abstractions of the historians and Bible scholars. Needless to say, the Atlas did not depict the narrow boundaries of the state of Israel at the time of publication, but only those of the powerful kingdoms of David and Solomon, as well as the battle moves of the various Israelite heroes. Not surprisingly, Aharoni was one of the first signatories of the whole Eretz Israel, a petition drafted following the Six-Day War in 1967, which called on all future governments of Israel never to cede an inch of the ancient homeland.